Hey everyone, welcome back to the Pathways to Happiness podcast. My name is Nena Lavonne. I am a life coach that specializes in life transformation and personal development. And today we are going to talk all about how we create our own internal suffering, specifically addressing the ideas of perfectionism, comparison, judgment, and what I collectively call the shoulds. Understanding and reversing these behaviors changed my entire life. And even if you are familiar already with these ideas, I'm going to really dive deep into them today. And we'll discuss why we gravitate to these toxic habits in the first place and some of the key principles in having a genuine, long-lasting sense of inner peace. So as always, before we jump into the topic, I wanted to give a quick thank you for being such amazing listeners and for your support both here and on the Nena Lavonne YouTube channel. And also to remind you that we have a questions and answers podcast coming up in a week or so. So please get those questions to me. You can email me at nena.lavonne@gmail.com, and that's spelled nena.lavonne@gmail. And you can also reach me on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is at Nena Lavonne. The questions I've gotten so far have been really interesting and kind of out of the box, so it's going to be a lot of fun answering them, but there's still space for more, so go ahead and send them on in. And that being said, let's get right into today's topic. So this question comes directly from one of our incredible listeners who asked point blank, how do we become unhappy? I remember being happy as a kid. What went wrong? I love this question, and I think we can all identify with it on some level, even if we don't really classify ourselves as being unhappy. We might just acknowledge that we experience an incredible amount of negative emotions. And yes, negative emotions are normal and a natural part of the human experience, but I think for many of us, we experience them a lot more than is necessary or really helpful. So I'm going to offer one approach to this question, and while I think it would be impossible to fully answer this question in a way that is relatable to everyone, I think this will apply to most of us, at least on some level. So as a general rule, we don't come into this world unhappy. We really do bloom where we are planted. It doesn't matter where we live, what we look like. If we feel safe and provided for, we usually feel pretty content. Now, there are certainly exceptions to every rule, and of course, for one, not everyone actually does feel safe and loved as children, but that's a subject for another podcast. So going with the premise that we did feel happy and perfectly content at one point or another in our life, why did that change for so many of us? How did life get so complicated? How do we go from perfectly content to having to constantly try to figure out why we aren't as happy as we could be, or why we are always anxious or stressed out? How does it go from one end of the spectrum to the other? This is something that I have thought a lot about, and of course, this is something that has had a lot of research and a lot of theories behind it, but honestly, it's really not a cut and dry answer. So I will give you my take and what I really noticed held me back personally, and some of the different ways that I created suffering for myself in the past. And my hope is that if any of these sound familiar, that you can start to examine your own life and see if any of these concepts are problematic for you as well. Because like anything else, when we bring things like this into the light, when we notice them, and when we finally address them, we can correct these behaviors, we can change our habits, and in turn, stop creating this inner turmoil that ultimately really keeps us from having a peaceful or happy life. So let's start by going back to that first question. How do we go from happy to unsatisfied or to mentally restless? I think it starts when we make our first comparison, our first judgment, noticing someone is different than us or that we go about things in a different way. that's when we start to wonder if we actually measure up. Are we enough? If we're different than everybody else, is there something wrong with us? So I think that is really the start of it. And when we start questioning life, we start the process of labeling things as good or bad, as scary or safe, or as better or worse. But remember, it doesn't really start that way. At first, we are delighted by everything. We don't look at our ears or our noses in the mirror and worry that they're the wrong size or the wrong shape. We're just happy to have a nose or to have a set of ears. We don't look at our home and think, well, this place isn't that great. I could do better. We're happy where we are. It doesn't matter. It upsets us when we start getting older and start making these judgments about us. But when we're 3 years old, it doesn't matter if our favorite color is red and the person next to us likes blue. We don't get stressed out when our friends play with toys in a different way than us. We don't make judgments about ourselves or the people around us. We don't feel inferior. We don't ruminate over the past or worry endlessly about the future. We're just kind of free. We're living in the moment, and most of the time we're really enjoying the experience. And then little by little we start deciding that our lives need to go one way for us to be happy, that there is a firm set of positive and negatives, and we come up with all kinds of rules for ourselves on what is good and bad and what definitively makes us happy and what we feel will not. And as soon as we do that, we close off about 99% of the possibilities that we could have for our lives, and we invite in all kinds of avenues that can lead us into suffering. And we really get great at creating misery for ourselves, all completely with our brains, mind you, but the effect is often just as painful as something that is physical. So I'm going to give you a few of the worst offenders for the way we create our own suffering, but this is in no way a complete list, and I will certainly do a follow-up podcast in the near future where I talk about many more of these, but I thought focusing on a few of these would actually be more helpful so we can really go kind of a lot deeper into each one. So the first way that we create suffering for ourselves is through perfectionism. And this is something that I dealt with for years and years and years, and it was simply awful. So this is when we refuse to accept any standard short of perfection in our lives. And I am specifically talking about expecting ourselves to be perfect. I recently had someone write in the question, is perfectionism a mental illness? So I'm going to go ahead and answer that while we are on the topic of perfectionism. And the answer is no, it is not, but it is a risk factor for all kinds of disorders, for personality disorders, for substance abuse issues, for anxiety, for eating disorders, and even physical problems like heart disease and chronic stress. So definitely it is something we want to work on, but I have to offer the caveat that something being a risk factor does not mean that any of these disorders or issues or conditions will ever actually manifest. It just means that there is an association. So no, it is not a mental illness, but it certainly causes a lot of harm for us. So I am going to give you some of the warning signs of perfectionism so you can see if any of these ring a bell for you. And again, most of these things were traits that I dealt with in the past. So you are in good company if these sound familiar. These are things that are very common. So the first one is that you criticize yourself often. You are spotting mistakes. You look for imperfections. You are really hard on yourself when you feel that you could have done better at something. The second thing is that you fear failure. You perceive anything that you don't view as perfect as some kind of failure, even when there is success tied to it. The next one is that you have unrealistic standards or you set goals for yourself that are not even achievable. So we have this all or nothing mentality where, again, even when something is nearly perfect, we feel upset about it as if it was just a complete failure, a complete mess. The fourth one is that we procrastinate because we fear failure so much that we're scared to get started because we're worried that we're not going to get it right. The fifth one is we are defensive and take even the most constructive of criticisms in the worst possible way instead of seeing the information as valuable or as a chance to enhance our performance or enhance our lives. So if these are traits that you easily recognize in your own self, it is safe to say that you are likely creating a lot of suffering for yourself. There are many ways to attack this way of thinking, but I will share what worked for me, and that is what I call the strategy of 80%. So to give a little backstory for it, I ran my own business and I just had an overwhelming amount of tasks that I had to do all the time. Just lists and lists and lists of different things of all different types that I needed to do. And sometimes it would just get so much that I did not know where to start. And of course, I wanted to do everything perfectly. So I was not, giving more weight to some things and less to other things. Everything was just gravely important to me that I got exactly right, and I wanted to please everybody and make everybody happy. So once I realized how problematic this was in my life, I sat down with myself and asked myself if I could take all of these things off my plate, if they could just be all magically done by some other person. What degree of perfection would I find acceptable enough to be okay with it just being done at that percentage? And what I came up with was actually 80%. Now, that is quite different from how I would normally do tasks, because I like to do tasks at 100% or actually be an overachiever and deliver at over 100%. So I was running at trying to do everything at 130% for everyone else 100% of the time. So again, not achievable, but when I thought about it, 80% seems like a wonderful trade for it just being done. So I realized that if I would really ultimately be happy with 80%, that's all I can ask of myself. Because unfortunately, the alternative is that a lot of things are not going to get done at all. So done is way better than perfect. And if we are always requiring ourselves to do things to a standard of what we consider to be perfect, there's not that many things that we can actually do, first of all. And second of all, nothing can actually be done perfect. What is perfect? Perfect is not even a standard that is measurable or achievable. So we are just kind of like a hamster in the wheel when we try to endlessly go after perfection. So that is the strategy that worked for me. And I always have to think about that. I have to think when I'm starting something, I'm going to do this aiming at 80%, knowing in the back of my head that I'm going to want to do this at 200%. So 80% is probably going to be closer to 100% than it would be for another person. But for me, it is letting myself off the hook at least somewhat. And thinking about that 80% honestly did change my life. I had to put it on Post-its everywhere, and I have to, again, tell myself sometimes out loud when I start something, 80% is fine. That is more than most of the world gives. And honestly, when we aim for 80%, we actually get a lot closer to that 100%. But when we are trying to hold ourselves to a standard of 200%, that is going to lead to nothing but severe burnout. So the next one is comparison. I'm going to throw this one out there, but recently I made a podcast all about this topic. So if you need to go really deep into this one, the name of the podcast is How to Stop Comparing Yourself to Other People. So you can search it up here on the podcast or on the Nena Lavonne YouTube channel. But I do want to give it a little overview before we completely move on from it. So my favorite quote about comparison is by Theodore Roosevelt, who said, "Comparison is the thief of joy." And that statement is correct on every single level. So comparison is a great way to just cause endless suffering for ourselves. So I have a few thoughts about this. The first one is that absolutely no one has a perfect life. Everybody has challenges or problems. Now, they don't always put them out for the world to see, but that is certainly the case. Comparisons are always, always, always unfair. We are comparing what we feel are the worst parts of us to the absolute best aspects that we presume are true about other people. And I'm using the word presume because, again, usually we are not correct in our assumptions. So that's the first thing we have to remember. The second thing is hard to hear, but it is also a truth, and that is that there will always be people that are better than us at something. It is easier to just accept this fact. It is not defeat, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try in life to be our best or to move forward. But we aren't always going to be the winners. So judging ourselves in that way leads to, again, endless suffering because we are asking ourselves to always be best, and that is not a physical possibility. So again, this kind of goes along with perfectionism, but we do have to understand that it does not matter how much effort that we put in, we're not always going to be the top. We're not always going to be the winners, and that is fine. In life, we do not have to be the winners to be happy. We just need to be trying our own personal best. The next thing I want to mention about comparison is that within comparison, we have nothing to gain, but we have so much to lose. So we can lose our dignity, our pride, our drive, our passion, our self-esteem. But again, we gain nothing by comparing ourselves because we never compare ourselves in a way that we think, hey, yeah, we're better than that person. We've got this. We always compare ourselves and then somehow figure that we are less than other people. And you can just imagine what that does to ourselves when we are doing this constantly on a daily basis. The next thing is that the habit of comparison leads to an endless cycle of constantly seeing how we stack up against other people. So this habit doesn't disappear when we obtain success. We just find something or somebody else to compare ourselves to. So we are constantly judging ourselves. It is a never ending cycle. Comparison also takes the focus off the person that you really should be caring about, which is yourself. Now, I don't mean that we shouldn't care about other people. Of course, we should care about other people, but we have to take care of ourselves. And we can control only one life, which is our own life. But when we constantly compare ourselves to other people, we waste our precious energy focusing on the lives of other people instead of our own. And really what people do in their own life has nothing to do with us. It's none of our business. We have completely separate lives, and we should not be comparing ourselves because honestly, we are too unique to compare. Our lives are too different. There is no such thing as an even playing field. There's always going to be apples and oranges. We are never really seeing the real picture of other people. We're always only seeing how they want us to view them. So we are seeing some kind of projected, manufactured image, and then we are comparing our real true self to that. So of course we're not going to stack up. Another problem is that comparisons can result in a lot of resentment towards other people and towards ourselves. So when we compare and we feel inferior, we sometimes start feeling angry at that person or jealous or, create a lot of negative emotions. And they really did nothing. They're just living their own life. Or, maybe they are putting it out there in a way that makes their life seem more perfect or more appealing than ours. But still, it's not a reason to feel resentment towards them because really we need to be thinking about our own life. But unfortunately, it happens all the time. We are blaming them for what we think are our own misfortunes or our own shortcomings. And lastly, comparisons really serve no helpful purpose. They add no value, they add no meaning, they add no positivity, they add no fulfillment to our lives, and they distract us from moving forward and making progress and ultimately from feeling happy. Comparisons actually flat out block happiness. And I know in this age of social media that it is so hard not to compare because, again, it's right in our face. But we've got to stop the cycle if we want to stop the suffering. So please do check out that podcast if this is something that is holding you back, because this is something that holds back so many people. And now we get to one of the worst and biggest offenders of all, which is judgment and the need to control how other people live their life. And this really leads into my next point. So I'm going to kind of lump it all together and address all of these at once. And I call these the shoulds or the musts. And the shoulds and the musts ran my life for decades. So these are all really related concepts. So I'm going to try to explain them all so you can see the subtle differences, but they all have the same very negative effect. So the shoulds and the musts are internal rules that we set for ourselves. Again, definitely not something that we have in our genetics. These inclinations start to come as we begin to have life experiences. They are not really about the actual events, however, that are happening. They are actually centered on what we want or what we do not want to experience, including emotionally, and what we fear could happen if these expectations and these desires are not met. So in other words, we have a plan. We have a plan that turns into all kinds of rules that we create for ourselves that we think are the only true paths for us to get what we want. And these shoulds end up controlling our lives. I'm going to try to explain this in another way because this concept is so critical. And again, this is something that really was problematic for me. So shoulds are basically a list of inflexible rules that we create that dictate how we believe ourselves and other people should and must follow. So the thought process here is this is how we all have to act. These are the beliefs that we all need to have. This is how we all need to live our life. So that really is the basic idea, that there is a clear right and wrong, and that we ourselves, of course, want to follow this particular path and these particular rules. But it also becomes upsetting to us when other people are deviating from this path. And that is where the judgment comes in. We start finding fault in other people because they aren't following the rules that we think are the right rules. So we have a problem with how they act and how they think. They should be following these rules in our eyes, so it makes it difficult for us to tolerate them when they are not doing so. It doesn't even make sense to us a lot of times. We feel that, it is so obvious that we can't even understand how they are deviating from this. So it becomes incredibly problematic. Now, a lot of times we can see this clearly in politics when we feel that there is one candidate that is great and the other one that is terrible. And it doesn't matter what side of the fence that you are on. You just know that the other side is wrong. So we start to get really emotionally invested in how other people feel that, the politics should run and what candidate is best and what their view on the different issues are. Even though it's their life, we want them to conform to how we think. So we try to police their thoughts, we try to police their opinions and their behaviors, and it becomes really exhausting. So one of my favorite psychiatrists of all time, her name is Karen Horney, and you may recognize that name because I did a video on one of her theories, which is the theory of neurotic needs, which is really fascinating. I have a video on that, like I said, so you can search that one up as well if you're interested. But she called this concept the tyranny of shoulds. And she pointed out that when we live by shoulds, it always makes somebody wrong. So either we are wrong or other people are wrong. So someone is always not doing what they should. So obviously, we all have a code of ethics that is, of course, important. And obviously, it is never acceptable for a person to have actions that harm others in any way. But the shoulds and the musts go far, far beyond that. So it all comes down to whether our judgments are helpful in our life or harmful. And some of the things that might indicate that they are helpful is if they are life enhancing, if they are realistic, if we have taken the time to examine them personally as opposed to have had them kind of interjected in us, or to have never questioned them ourselves and came to the conclusion that yes, these are, the correct values and morals that we should be following. And also, if we understand in our life that there will be times and situations that we will need to make exceptions to these rules, that we need to be able to be flexible when it is necessary. And this is a topic that I definitely want to get even deeper into at a later date. But again, I wanted to touch upon this today because this was a huge theme that ran through my life that caused just, again, so much suffering. And I also wanted to share a little bit about how I personally overcame this. I was able to drop the shoulds at some point, and I decided and understood that I needed to find my own way. I couldn't live up to the rules, the expectations, the decisions or judgments of other people. And I couldn't even live up to the ones that I had created for my own self because they weren't authentic. I was also completely exhausted by trying to convince the rest of the world that I was right, that the way that I thought or the way I lived my own life was correct and that they were wrong. I had finally understood that there is not one right way to live. It is what is right for that person. And I was done with rules, with everybody else's rules, and I was done with my own internal rules. So think of it this way. A should is usually created out of someone else's expectations of us. Could be valid, it could be constructive, or it could be in direct opposition to what we really value and the expectations that we authentically have and want for our own lives. So we have to question them all of them. We have to ask ourselves what feels right for us. And that is exactly what I did. I had to figure out what just was exhausting or unnecessary or disingenuous. We simply can't live our life for other people, but we are doing it both consciously and subconsciously all of the time. But the second we say no to this, the second we start making our own rules and setting our own boundaries, the second we really experience freedom. And I know it is tough. We want to please everyone. I have totally been there. I've been there for most of my life. But now I understand that pleasing other people or going along constantly with shoulds and musts isn't really loving or honoring that person if internally we are resisting it or we don't believe in it. It's nothing really but a sugar-coated lie, and that is easier to deliver a lot of times than being assertive, which is a lot of the motivation, at least it was for me. But loving others truly requires honesty, and that can be painful. It can be really, really painful, and so we avoid it. But when we avoid it, we create suffering. We create a lot of it. And if we are trying to control other people, to design their life, or to convince them that we are right and that our way is better, then we're never going to be happy, and they aren't going to be either. Shoulds are toxic. They're toxic all around. They're unrealistic. Life is simply not in black and white. It is primarily in the grays, and making lots of rules for ourselves or for other people just makes it a lot more confusing. And if I had to boil it down for what strategy of letting go of suffering was the most important, or what the central theme was, it would be this one. Let other people live their lives the way that is right for them, and stop preventing yourself from living the life that you want to authentically and the way that you really need to. So at the end of the day, we have ourselves to face. We have ourselves to take care of, to love, and to be kind to. And, when we are being kind to other people, we accept them for how they are. And we need to offer ourselves that same kindness, that same self love. And when we can learn to create less suffering for ourselves, we actually cause a lot less suffering in the lives of other people. And like I said, these are just the tip of the iceberg. But if you're anything like me, you are coming to realize that many of these habits and these behaviors do ring a bell, and they are things that we need to start to bring into the light and ultimately let go of. I am a firm believer that happiness is in our own hands, and in our hands alone. And the less suffering that we create, the more space we have for joy and for happiness in our life. So that's where I'm going to leave it today, but please let me know which of these resonated with you the most, or what other factors that you have found to be problematic for you, and the strategies that you like to use to work on them. So as always, I want to thank you so much for spending time with me today. It's always so enjoyable for me, and I greatly look forward to the next time. Have an extraordinary day, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care, guys.